good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to the panel on climate and the wealth economy, integrating science, law, economics, and policy. My name is Linda Muhugusa. Sophie Quinlan and I will be your Zoom moderators for the session, chaired by Dr. Matthew Agarwala and Dr. Alexandra Harrington. It goes without saying that we are in excellent hands for this session. Dr. Agarwala is a leading economist in the field of sustainability. His work focuses on wealth-based approaches to measuring and delivering sustainability, well-being, and productivity. Dr. Agarwala leads the Bennett Institute's Wealth Economy Project and regularly advises governments and scientific organizations on areas of natural capital, ecosystem services, green finance, well-being, and sustainability. Dr. Agarwala has written many articles on the wealth economy and is a regular media contributor to leading media companies such as Bloomberg, the New York Times, the Financial Times, and many more. Dr. Harrington is an international law expert, scholar, author, and consultant in the field of environmental law, international trade law, corporate social responsibility, sustainable development, and human rights law. She is the executive director of the Center for Global Governance and Emerging Law and serves as a consultant for the many organizations such as the Commission for Environmental Cooperation of the North American Agreement on Environmental Cooperation and UN Environment. It is an honor to welcome you all to this fascinating session, and it is with immense pleasure that I hand over you to our chairs.
Hello, and thank you very much for that generous introduction. My name is Matthew, and I am delighted on behalf of the co-chairs, myself and Alex Harrington, to welcome you to this excellent session as part of the Climate Change, Sustainable Development Goals and the Law Conference. The session that we're about to begin is entitled Climate and the Wealth Economy, Integrating Science, Law, Economics, and Policy. It's going to be a fast-paced session. We have some brilliant speakers from all around the world, some who I've worked with for years, some who I studied with about a decade ago, and others who I get to meet for the first time today. What I'd like to do is, as quickly as possible, move straight into our opening remarks by a longtime friend and trusted colleague of mine and special advisor to the Wealth Economy Project here at the Bennett Institute, Dr. Dimitri Zenghelis. Dimitri will speak to us about building forward by investing in resilient assets for sustained recovery. Dimitri, welcome.
Thank you so much, Matthew, and hello to everybody. So I'm going to talk about the broad conceptualization of wealth all around us and how it is both important that we monitor and measure it and recognize how the composition and valuation of that wealth is likely to change. So hopefully that will set the scene for the discussion that follows. And the first thing, it sounds a bit trite, but it bears repeating. The world is changing rapidly, and perhaps it's changing more rapidly than ever. And the important point here is that it's very clear that the 21st century will not be like the 20th century in terms of the makeup of our society and our economies. And most obviously, the economy of the 21st century is highly likely to be low carbon and less reliant on fossil fuels, more resource efficient and highly digitized. Increasingly, we're going to have to put less pressure on natural resources, in particular, the renewable kind. That is, those natural resources that when they reach certain thresholds are subject to irreversible collapse, things like biodiversity, forests, fisheries and ecosystems, as well as a non-polluted climate. And it's important to note that climate and environmental degradation are two sides of the same coin. It will be impossible to reduce emissions low enough to have to eliminate dangerous climate change without preserving our natural environment, and it'll be impossible to avoid environmental degradation if you've got runaway climate change. The two really do work together, and they have very similar drivers as well. The second thing to note is that the transition is likely to be massive. This is no surprise. Since the Industrial Revolution, fossil fuels and mineral resources have powered the world economy. And if we're to meet our climate targets, for example, consistent with a 2-degree temperature increase, let alone a 1.5-degree temperature increase, just the 2-degree target means that about a third of the world's oil reserves, half of the world's gas reserves, and almost all the world's coal reserves will have to remain in the ground, or if they're burnt, the emissions will have to be captured and stored. And it doesn't stop with the fossil fuels in the ground. Downstream infrastructure, transport infrastructure, ports, railway lines, refineries, carbon-intensive industries, power generation, they're all at risk of being stranded if they're carbon-intensive. And then linked to that, of course, the financial services that are heavily invested in fossil fuel entangled assets will also be hit with concerns around systemic and sovereign risk. So this transition will touch everybody, and the value of our wealth is likely to change dramatically. The composition of wealth is likely to change because greater value is likely to be attributed to the kinds of things that become more important. Knowledge and intangible capital, including social capital, and of course natural capital. And the value of things like fossil fuels and environmentally destructive raw materials is likely to diminish as we seek to substitute out of activities that degrade the natural environment and contribute to climate change. And it's not just physical assets, of course, it's not just the buildings and the factories and the infrastructure, it's the skills, it's the human capital, and it's the ideas that are at risk of becoming devalued and stranded. Assets that were once valuable could very quickly become a liability. And that's going to mean new requirements to monitor and measure broad assets if we're to keep on top with the challenges and the threats to our future well-being. And of course, that forms the mainstay of the activities that we undertake in the Wealth Economy Project in Cambridge. It's going to mean, it will necessitate reassessing corporate wealth as well. The risk of stranded assets means going beyond just disclosure of a company's emissions and resource use. It's increasingly the case that access to cheap finance and investment will depend on demonstrating that the assets you invest in as a company or as a financial provider will not be stranded in a carbon and resource constrained world of the future. So this is why climate-related financial reporting is increasingly becoming mandatory, and forward-looking scenarios which stress test against some of the more extreme changes, hostile policy environments, rapid technological change, the kind of stuff that sounds extreme before it happens, but actually tends to happen very quickly. These are going to have to form a key part of risk management when undertaking informed investment and asset allocation decisions. And of course, to unlock this private capital, because it's private capital that's going to supply the several $1 trillion a year necessary in terms of additional investment to decarbonize our economy, it's going to require governments to design credible and predictable policy intervention so as to give those investors and companies the clarity and confidence they need that a low carbon future will be a profitable one. And let's not forget the kind of sectors we're talking about here. We're talking about energy, we're talking about transport, we're talking about land use, we're talking about buildings. These are about the most heavily regulated and policy driven sectors on the planet. So of course, policy risk is going to be a key deterrent to private investment. But we're also going to need to reassess public sector wealth assumptions. We're seeing at the moment that despite mounting public debt levels as a percentage of GDP, the markets continue to signal an understanding that the most promising way to bring down public debt in the medium term is not to prematurely introduce austerity, but to actually borrow at favorable rates to invest in growing the economy's capacity. Now, I'm not just saying this, this is revealed ex post by the sustained low neutral real interest rates that we're seeing, which suggests that they continue to want to lap up public sector debt in order to chase returns, even as debt to GDP is reaching record levels. It's also revealed empirically through the presence of large estimated short and long run multipliers. Organizations such as the IMF suggesting that the multipliers could be between 2 or 3. In other words, plenty of scope for fiscal crowding in. Investing in the public sector's net worth, noting that the asset side is often unobservable, boosts returns to assets. In other words, it generates the revenues that allow you to pay down the debt. So borrowing to invest can be a very good way to debt sustainability. And simple debt dynamics tell you that if G is greater than R, then you can carry on running budget deficits. And we know that R is very low, and a big part of the focus post-COVID-19 has been on G. G means growth, by the way, for those not familiar with debt dynamics equations. This has followed 2 decades of underinvestment, declining productivity growth, and mounting climate and ecological risk. So the key part of the building back or building forward narrative is getting more out of the resources that we have. In other words, the process of innovation to increase resource productivity and improve demand responsiveness. And finally, and this is close to my heart, we're going to have to repurpose economics. The speed of the transition in key sectors has caught everybody by surprise. And this has happened with minimal policy effort. 10 years ago, renewables and electric vehicles were seen as prohibitively expensive, generating eye-watering costs. If I was sitting here 10 years ago and I told you that the cost of solar PV or lithium-ion batteries would fall by 80% over a decade, you'd probably laugh me out of court. And yet that is indeed what has happened. And economics needs to be prepared for the possibility of these rapid transitions and understand their drivers. The world now invests more in renewable generation as it happens, and that excludes nuclear and hydro, than it does in oil, coal, and gas combined. That's the flow into the stock, but the stock is changing. The IEA tells us that renewables will overtake coal to become the biggest source of electricity generation in stock terms as soon as 2025. That's only a couple of years away. And no serious auto manufacturer is investing scarce R&D anymore in the combustion engine. So these changes are subject to tipping points that happen very, very quickly. And what happened in these sectors was that renewable and electric vehicle capacity grew faster than anyone expected because costs fell sharply, and costs fell sharply because capacity grew faster than anybody expected. So the new technologies rapidly undercut the old. The problem for economics that we need to address is that conventional models based on static optimization and inappropriate assumptions just can't cope with the destabilizing dynamics generated by these kinds of amplifying feedback. So they just miss them out altogether, and therefore they miss out the rapid cost reductions that they entail. And as a result, standard economic and energy forecasting models over the last decades have been hopeless. They've been demonstrably wrong and consistently understating both the pace of deployment and the speed of the cost reductions in some of these new technologies. So we need to really revamp our approach to account for these kinds of things. And because costs are endogenous and risks are path dependent, then the costs and risks of a transition are not independent. They're conditional on the actions, the investments, the policy decisions that we take today. And this makes early policy and investment choices more important than traditional economic theory suggested. So it really adds a greater premium on early and ambitious, credible policies. And then just a final note, at a time of rapid and disruptive change, disruption is something we all kind of like to think of as a welcome change, but disruption is also disruptive. There will be losers as well as winners, and we need to be acutely aware of the distributional consequences of change, especially when change is happening as rapidly as it is, and especially when we are trying to make change happen even more rapidly as part of our policy objectives. So a just transition needs to be one that's seen, not only just be inclusive, but be seen to be inclusive and fair if it's to garner the political support and traction that we need. It's going to require retooling and reskilling workers to enable them to participate in new opportunities. And it's going to require undermining the kinds of barriers to change, which are more often than not political and institutional rather than technological and economic. So we have a changing landscape of risk and opportunity and a corresponding change on how we value core assets and how we use the economic toolkit to assess and respond to these challenges. And I think that's hopefully going to be part of the discussion today. I will stop there. I will hand it back to Matthew to introduce the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. I think everybody can understand why he's not just a special advisor to my project here at the Wealth Economy in the Bennett, but he's also a fellow at the London School of Economics and lead author of the landmark Stern Review on the economics of climate change. Thank you very much. You've set the scene beautifully for us, Dimitri, with a rundown of the economics that we need rather than the economics that we have. To continue us along in that vein of thought, we have a series of papers now which operate at the intersection between economics and the law, which is very much the theme of this conference. I'm delighted now to turn to Catherine Higham, who will be joining us from the London School of Economics, the Grantham Research Institute for Climate Change and the Environment. She'll be speaking about accountability mechanisms in climate change framework legislation. Thank you very much, Catherine. You have the floor.
Great. Thank you very much, Matthew. And it's a pleasure to be here today with you all. As Matthew has said, I'm going to introduce a paper on accountability in climate change framework laws, written with a number of GRI colleagues, Dr. Alina Averchenkova, Dr. Joana Setzer, and Arnaud Coel. So next slide, please. Firstly, I wanted to talk to you about why we chose to look at framework laws and why we chose to look at this issue of accountability. So what are framework laws? Well, they are defined as national level legislation that establishes long-term climate change objectives, as well as creating some, not normally all, of the policies and institutions required to meet them. The laws are far from the only climate change legislation in the world. There are fewer than 50 of them globally, as compared to around 2,000 laws and policies, but they have significant symbolic importance. And selecting this smaller group of legislation was also more practical for us for purposes of comparability. Another point that informed our decision to do this research was the fact that we know that this is an issue that both legislators and civil society are increasingly interested in, particularly since framework laws are likely to be the legal mechanism in which legislated climate targets, including net zero climate targets, can be found. And that's really how I think this connects to the topic of this session. In many contexts, the strength of a framework law as a means to create accountability will be the administrative context and the legal context in which the law sits. Creating clear obligations in a law will be enough to ensure it's subject to judicial review in many jurisdictions. However, in national contexts with weaker institutions, that may not be sufficient. So incorporating accountability mechanisms explicitly within the text of a law is one way to address some wider issues or gaps. Next slide, please. So in order to understand how accountability mechanisms can be integrated into legislation, we first need to understand what accountability mechanisms or accountability systems are. To do this, we drew on Earth systems governance literature to identify 4 key elements or building blocks that we think should be present in any accountability system. Much of this literature looks at global governance systems involving both governmental and non-governmental actors, and we applied this same logic in the domestic context. While we take judicial enforcement of legal obligations through the courts as one mechanism by which a law can create accountability, we think that's far from the only mechanism, and indeed it's often not mentioned at all. So we're thinking when we're looking at this about things like transparency, monitoring, reporting, and verification systems. We're also thinking about disclosure regimes for private parties, which may aim to stimulate accountability relationships between different private actors. So you can see here on the screen our version of each of these 4 elements. We have sort of the what of an accountability system, the obligation. We have the who, who is responsible for that obligation and who they're responsible to. We have the how, the process for assessing the obligations. And we also have an important kind of point, what next if an obligation hasn't been fulfilled. Many of the mechanisms that we looked at in this research and that you find in climate change framework legislation at the moment don't actually contain very clear-cut provisions on the what next. In some cases, this is because these are sort of trust-based accountability systems, which rely on the idea of giving an account for something rather than the idea of corrections or sanctions. But we think it's important that those 2 things operate together. So once we'd identified these 4 elements, we then mapped how they can and should appear in climate change framework laws. Next slide, please. So on this slide, you can see a bit of a sense of what that mapping looks like. You can see the various different types of obligation and relationships and processes that we mapped across all of the legislation that we looked at. But I'll take you through a specific example you may be familiar with to give you a kind of sense of how this works. So if we take the UK Climate Change Act 2008, which is one of the oldest climate change framework laws and one of the most discussed, we know one of the core obligations within this is an obligation to meet net zero emissions by 2050. And sitting behind that target, there are a series of 5-yearly carbon budgets, which are set 12 years in advance. The Act contains multiple explicit accountability mechanisms around this obligation to achieve net zero emissions, as well as creating implicit obligations. And the explicit elements are the ones that I've highlighted with continuous lines around them in red. So these include kind of parliamentary oversight, review by the Committee on Climate Change, and they're mostly underpinned by processes that are essentially grounded in reporting. But there are also a number of implicit accountability processes created in the Act. For example, because the 2050 target is broken down into short-term carbon budgets and accompanied by requirements to produce plans on how each of those carbon budgets will be met, they really allow the Act to lend itself to judicial scrutiny as well as to public scrutiny. One point to note, we don't see a lot in the Climate Change Act that is explicit on this what next question, what happens if targets aren't met. There are some assumptions we can make about that from the text of the law, but it's not explicit. Next slide, please. So I won't send, sorry, could you go back to the other one? It's a slide, yeah, perfect, thank you. I won't spend very long here, but this is just to show you that unlike in the UK Act, there are some examples where there are very strong, explicit sanctions-based regimes created in framework laws. If we look at Uganda's law, Article 21 of the law provides a person may apply to the High Court for relief against the government, an individual or a private entity whose action or omission threatens or is likely to threaten efforts towards adaptation to or mitigation of climate change. The provision goes on to say that standing to bring this kind of action is very broad. There's no requirement to demonstrate specific harm. And it specifies that the court can give a wide range of orders in response to any breach of obligations. So one thing we note in the paper is that there are clear benefits to this kind of provision, which gives a lot of clarity on the role of the courts and addresses issues like standing, which have caused problems in climate change litigation to date. Next slide, please. So after looking at the kinds of obligations and relationships created across the laws, we mapped these in a heat map showing where the focus of existing legislation really sits. And you can see here, oh, thank you, Matthew. I'm running over time. So maybe if I just skip to the end. So next slide, please, and next slide. So just to pull out a few of the recommendations that we drew out of this paper. Firstly, we think it's really important that climate change framework laws explicitly include all four of the accountability elements that we've discussed. MRV processes are important, but they should be understood as a real bare minimum. And it's also really crucial that obligations are clear and detailed in design. We think it's really important that laws take into account the need for parliamentary oversight. This is the best way to assess both compliance and effectiveness. We think overall laws need to contain much greater clarity on sanctions and corrective action, and that trust-based systems should be paired with accountability-based systems. And then we also think that laws should be looking at creating a mandate for regulation of private entities or regulating private entities directly. So thank you very much for that, and happy to take questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Catherine, and all for that lovely and very insightful presentation. And I know there are many questions that I'm sure Matthew and I could ask for a great deal of time, so we will hold our own until later on. And without any further ado, introduce our next speaker. And it is my great professional and personal privilege to introduce Advocate Magdalena Stryja, who is joining us from the University of Silesia in Katowice in Poland, which you may remember hosted COP24 several years ago in 2018, which seems like a long time ago already. But Advocate Stryja is the organizational manager and spokesperson of the Faculty of Law and Administration of the University of Silesia. She's also the chairwoman of the Science and Development Committee at the District Bar Council in Katowice. So Magdalena, I give you the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Alexandra. Can I ask for my presentation? Good afternoon. It's such a pleasure to be here to join you today and to share some of my reflection and experiences about concept of just transition, Poland situation, and why it is so crucial. I will try to explain during my speech. So to start, thank you, and can I ask for next slide? To start with, let's recap on the key concept behind the just transitions. And just transition involves the implementation of policies aiming to create a fair and prosperous future for workers and communities as the world builds a low carbon economy. It makes sure that no groups of workers or communities get left behind as a result of the low carbon transition. This is also central to the UNFCCC principles and the Paris Agreement. A just transition also involves relevant stakeholders, giving them the right to be heard at the stage of planning, implementing, and evaluating the transformation process. And finally, the just transition also reflects the need for justice between generations and between countries. Some of the biggest global polluters have enjoyed the status of high-income countries based on carbon-related development. However, it is clear that to avoid a global climate catastrophe, action is required by all nations, and the just transition can help facilitate this across all countries. In terms of history, just transition has evolved from a political slogan of the 1980s American trade union movement to a legal one over the past decades. The term is featured in the Paris Agreement only briefly, but still this established the idea that reversing the effects of climate change cannot be separated from global and regional justice. The Paris Agreement was a key step towards attaching legal grounding to the concept of just transitions. The next progress came at the following COP24 in Katowice, when just transition became a central component of the Silesia Declaration on Solidarity and Just Transition, signed by over 50 countries. And just transition is an integral part of Katowice rulebook at the outcomes of Katowice COP. And the Katowice rulebook provides a roadmap for countries to enact laws and rules based on the Paris Agreement, the first ever executive tool to stimulate more effective activities and cooperation at a regional and international level. The next stage came in 2019 when the European Commission presented a European Green Deal aimed at implementing the policy of climate neutrality and United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. This delivered the multi-billion euro just transition mechanism, which is a key tool to ensure that the transition to a climate neutral economy is carried out fairly, leaving no one left behind. In 2021, just transition became the central concept of EU regulation 2021/1056 on the just transition fund, adopted by the European Union, taking another steps towards making the concept of just transformation more legal. Unlike the Silesian Declaration, which took the form of international soft law, the regulation is a legal act of the EU directly applicable to its member states. So you can see that just transition has developed dramatically from a political slogan for soft international law, finally to a legal regulation which affects 500 million EU citizens and tens of billions of euros invested via the just transition mechanism. So how about the Polish context? And third slide, please. It is clear to everyone who knows Poland that the transition to a low carbon economy will be a big challenge, and that the risk of not managing this change are significant. For example, of the 50 most polluted cities in Europe, 36 are in Poland. Poland is certainly not new to big transformation, having transitioned to a market economy during the 1990s. The 1990s provide lessons about the risk associated with shock therapy without the focus on social outcomes. The actual economic transformation was successful, but the social impacts were catastrophic for some. The approach to achieving social peace in the 1990s came at a high cost. Many of those who lost jobs in failing heavy industries were given cash payouts, which were often used to buy consumer products with little long-term benefit. There was no focus on retraining, so many skilled workers were prematurely and permanently removed from labor market. It is essential that the Poland reflects on these past experiences as it begins its own work on the EU Green Deal and just transition. We have to remember that around a quarter of coal companies currently opening in the EU are in Poland, employing 500,000 people. And in the years 2017 to 2020, Poland barely achieved any reduction in emissions. Indeed, a report on 31st August 2021 by Poland's own Supreme Audit Office on the years 2017-2020 was highly critical of Polish climate change policy in these years. The Polish government and the National Energy Office are designed to bring about progress, but instead the report found that they had increased the barriers to taking proper action. The report found that a lack of long-term strategy, legal instrument, and consistent implementation was greatly slowing down the transformation process. As a result, the sectors like onshore wind farms, photovoltaics, small hydropower plants, thermal waste treatment installation, geothermal had almost stopped developing. But we have now 2021, and the Polish government enacted the energy strategy to 2040, and this works towards, next slide, please. This work towards EU target and commitments building on 3 core pillars of just transition, zero emissions, and good air quality. And energy strategy makes a number of important commitments. For example, that the planned transformation will be designed to create up 300,000 new jobs in a green economy. Activities related to the transformation of core regions are to be supported with funds worth around 50 billion euros. Development of the internal energy market to ensure the security of supply, making sure Poland is energy safe and independent, investment in research, innovation, and new technologies on a world stage. And this will also be an important part of the country's pandemic recovery, helping to support those who lost jobs and businesses to retrain or redirect their businesses' activities. The strategy also outlines the steps required to build social awareness of the need for just transition and the benefits it will bring. So in summary, next slide, please, the last one. Without a successful transformation in Poland, European climate policy has no chance of success. This makes Poland a particularly important participant in the transformation processes and the discussion on their conditions and course. And from the point of view of climate policy, Poland is therefore the most problematic and key area of the European Union. I hope that I fit in time. Thank you very much for your attention. It was an honor to be here and to speak for you today. Thank you, Mary Claire. Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you all.
And thank you so much, Magdalena. That was absolutely fascinating. And again, I'm sure we all have lots of comments for you or questions. And I will turn now, again, a great personal and professional honor to introduce Advocate Ayman Shirkawi, who is joining us actually in Cambridge from the Mohammed VI Foundation for Environmental Protection in Morocco. He also is a lead counsel at the Center for International Sustainable Development Law. He's the lead counsel for climate change, so absolutely appropriate for this particular discussion. So wonderful to see you, my friend, and I give the floor to you.
Thank you very much. A pleasure to be here. Let me start my timer. I will be relying quite a lot on the dexterity of our kind support team as I'll be going over quite a few slides at pace. Thank you very much. I'll be focusing on a recent initiative to decarbonize the Moroccan economy. So the focus will be on Morocco. Next slide, please. Thank you. The Mohammed VI Foundation for Environmental Protection is chaired by Her Royal Highness Princess Al Hasna, and we focused on promoting the protection of the environment and the improvement of living conditions. Next slide, please. So I'll be discussing 3 things. First, very briefly, discuss the air climate program of the foundation. Then the core of what I want to carry in terms of messages, share with you is a task force. And then finally, provide you with some examples of South-South partnerships in Africa in the context of decarbonization. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So the foundation programs are aligned with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and the main areas of activities are around coastline and environmental awareness. Next slide, please. Last 2 years ago now, Her Royal Highness inaugurated Hassan II International Center for Environmental Training, an important space for regional hub of environmental education. Next slide, please. So what are some key dates of the air climate program of the foundation? It started almost 20 years ago by looking at fuel standards. Then we started looking at the interconnection between air quality and health. The foundation obtained observer status with NEUTRAPOL-C in 2009. 2016, of course, with the Marrakesh COP was a particularly important year for the activities of the Foundation on climate change. And more recently, in 2020 and 2021, we have been looking more broadly at how we can work with other stakeholders in Morocco to decarbonize the Moroccan economy and help support youth projects in Africa. Next slide, please. So the 2020-23 roadmap is focused on 3 horizons. First, short-term with nature-based solutions. We heard a lot about that earlier today. Mid-term in terms of the green recovery, in terms of the post-pandemic context, and long-term in terms of zero carbon and race to zero commitments. Next slide, please. Now, the task force to decarbonize the Moroccan economy. Next slide, please. Has as members 2 ministries in Morocco, the Ministry of Industry and Trade, the Ministry of the Energy Transition and Sustainable Development, the private sector as represented by the Moroccan Confederation of Enterprises, the Institute of Moroccan Normalization, and the Moroccan Agency for Energy Efficiency, the last member being the foundation itself as civil society stakeholder. Next slide, please. The objectives are threefold. First, to ensure the country's exemplarity and leadership in its commitment to decarbonize and for climate action. Two, to anticipate and seize the opportunities, risks and opportunities linked to the CBAM that is envisaged by the European Union. And lastly, facilitate the positioning of the green recovery and new relays of competitiveness of Moroccan economic stakeholders. Next slide, please. The action plan is focused on 2021 to 2025, and the first and immediate focus will be on updating and upgrading the greenhouse gas calculation tool that was developed by the foundation and its partners starting from 2011, launched in 2013, based in large part on the process used in France by our partners ADEME. And we are using more than 300 emission factors, including more than 100 that are contextualized. And there's work in place, currently launched, to further update and enhance that tool. Then the next medium-term and long-term objectives are there. Just earlier this week, we hosted a high-level event with 2 ministers in attendance and other high-level figures. Next slide, please. I'll go very briefly at some of the key points that were raised there. First, for the opening session, there was a strong sense that there is an opportunity in Morocco to be at the same time more competitive while becoming greener. And this is very important to highlight. There was also a sense that at COP22, the Paris Agreement is something that must be importantly upheld, and in all its and all the goals of the Paris Agreement must be pursued. Next slide, please. Regarding the other segments, there were 3 roundtables that looked at different sectors. So the first one being the industrial sector. In the next slides, I'll be looking at transport and then agriculture. So we had the first company join in the Maghreb region, and one of the first in Africa joined the Race to Zero. There was also an interesting perspective from the Moroccan steel industry that felt that the CBAM, as envisioned by the EU, could actually be an opportunity for the Moroccan steel industry, given the fact that it enjoys comparable advantages when it comes to the efforts that it has already made in terms of greening its impact. And there was then some sharing to the fact that early thought leadership has provided quite an advantage when it comes to seizing market opportunities at this point in time. Next slide, please. Regarding the transport sector, very, very different depending on what we're looking at. So this particular segment, we looked at air transport, road transport, and railway. And when it comes to the civil aviation, there are some short-term solutions, but they still are heavily relying on carbon offsetting. The air transport representative was also indicating that there's promising future linked to sustainable aviation fuels, and I think that connects also quite well to a presentation we had earlier. And the more long-term aspect linked to technological breakthroughs, particularly around plane that rely on hydrogen, could wait until 2035 before they are fully concrete, and they are also considering carbon capture solutions. The train transport and rail transport was providing some more immediate element of solution as the one that is the least carbon intensive, and the road transport in Morocco is quite atomized, which is quite challenging when it comes to coordinating a sector-wide approach on this issue. Next slide, please. Regarding the agriculture sector, the agriculture sector in Morocco is actually far less carbon intensive than many countries in the developed world, or so-called developed world, including in the EU. there was a strong sense that nature-based solutions must be considered, both when it comes to mitigation and adaptation, that efforts can still be made on some hard-to-abate segments, that it was very important to work directly with smallholder farmers to have a sustainable positive output, and that norms, and I think that connects quite well to some of the elements we had just 2 presentations ago, are very important when it comes to including regulatory approaches to making sure that there is a level playing field. Thank you. Next slide, please. Regarding African collaboration, and I will just conclude here within a minute. Regarding relevant South-South collaboration at the country level, you have relevant sub-regional cooperation. Agriculture plays a very important role in Africa. Energy, of course, when it comes to access, and the private sector-led initiatives that are unfortunately quite few in Africa, but there are still some that exist. Next slide, please. The Foundation coordinates 2 initiatives, one of them called the African Youth Climate Hub. Next slide, please. The African Youth Climate Hub has a series of components. Briefly, the incubation and e-learning are the most developed at this point in time. Yesterday, as part of Core 16, we launched the first e-learning module co-constructed with youth. Next slide, please. And the incubator was a process that we launched in December 2020 with a high-level climate champion for COP26. We received more than 200 applications from several dozen countries in Africa. And you can see the founding partners of this particular initiative. Next slide, please. This is an initiative co-constructed by youth, so we have African youth ambassadors there. Thank you. Next slide, please. The African Green Universities and Youth Education Network is something that we're doing in partnership with Union Environment Program, and you can see some key elements of that initiative on this slide. Thank you. Next slide, please. So I'll rest there. As you saw, there was a pretty fast-paced overview of some element of import. The key messages I wanted to outline are the fact that Morocco, as a developing country, is fully committed to decarbonizing its economy. It enjoys important competitive advantages. It believes that it can join both prosperity and significant climate ambition and action, and that all levels of civil society, private sector, public actors in Morocco are working close hand in hand, including through a South-South and triangular cooperation to further enhance that ambition and share the expertise and learn from other countries as well. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Ayman, for that outstanding presentation, bringing in the African Green Universities Network, the youth involvement that we have, and the range of initiatives and policies and how Morocco is addressing them. So from Cambridge to London, to Katowice, to Morocco, and now across to Michigan. I am delighted now to introduce Timothy Arvan, who will speak to us about the politics of carbon pricing, using evidence from British Columbia, California, and the United States Northeast. Timothy, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Matthew. It's an honor to be here today with you all. If I could have the presentation, please. Thank you so much. Yes. So I would like to speak to you briefly today about the politics of carbon pricing. Specifically, my research focuses on understanding partisan policy design, public opinion, and interest group dynamics around the implementation of politically durable carbon prices. And I'm aiming to just introduce some of these topics today with implications for policymakers in the US and around the world. Next slide, please. The work I present today has appeared recently in the Cambridge Journal of Science and Policy, and I'd just like to briefly acknowledge that this research stems from a deeper body of work developed by my PhD advisor at the University of Michigan, Professor Barry Rabe. Next slide, please. By way of introduction, by the end of the 20th century, market mechanisms were being championed to great effect in solving environmental challenges. For example, we had the sulfur dioxide emissions trading, which drastically curtailed acid rain from industrial facilities in the United States. And by the early 2000s, there was a bipartisan sentiment that carbon pricing was economically efficient and capable of decoupling emissions from economic growth, and that it would be a core pillar of US federal policy. The failure of subsequent legislation was shocking. In particular, the Waxman-Markey bill of the early Obama presidency was subject to sort of pork barrel politics, and nobody knew what was in the 1,400-page bill. It was never brought to the floor of the Senate for debate. And so we see that there is this real divide between the economic theory of carbon pricing and the politics in practice. Maybe this is because of consumers' aversion to the increased prices of carbon-intensive goods. We also have barriers from the distributional implications of environmental taxes, as we've seen with France's Gilets jaunes protests. We also have lack of trust in scientific institutions, heightened partisan polarization, and formidable opposition from the fossil fuel lobby. Politicians have, in the face of re-election, turned to less ambitious alternatives and toned down their aspirations in the face of these barriers. But we see that they can be overcome in certain circumstances. Next slide, please. Sometimes it takes a creative mix of innovation and luck, as we see in the case of British Columbia. In 2008, BC was able to introduce a tax on business and household carbon emissions, which has been durable despite opposition from both industry and from left-wing parties at various times. Using the terminology of John Kingdon, who is there in the center, Professor Emeritus in my department, this is because of a sudden shift in the so-called problem stream. Warmer winters in BC caused the proliferation of the mountain pine beetle in the upper left across millions of acres of forested lands. And over a period of several seasons, the infection of more than 300 million trees inflicted damages estimated at $6 billion. This acute localized crisis captured public imagination, and this was a great opportunity for BC's leaders to make the case for bold climate action. So Premier Gordon Campbell in the lower right was facing re-election, and together with his finance minister, Carol Taylor, in the lower left, advanced attacks with carbon dividends payments, distributing revenues back in uniform annual payments to households. These dividends were a genius response to the left-wing Axe the Tax campaigns led by Carol James in the upper right, who was concerned about the effect on low-income populations during a time of high gas prices. And so we've seen that over time, popularity of this carbon tax and its dividends has sustained legislation. Next slide, please. In another noteworthy example, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in New England is a cap and trade system across 11 states, representing around 10% of US CO2 emissions. And several aspects of RGGI's policy design have been crucial in the program's durability. First, it's narrowly focused on the electricity sector, and this simple design has decreased the need for complex oversight and has limited political resistance. RGGI regulates only power plants with capacities of over 25 megawatts, which is fewer than 200 total facilities. Still, emissions from the electricity generation have decreased 20% between 2012 and just before the pandemic, while electricity sales have remained virtually constant. Additionally, by encouraging the investment of revenues in energy efficiency programs and renewable energy technology development, RGGI states have demonstrated this transparent linkage between emissions trading costs and concrete benefits. RGGI bears out the theory of political scientist Herbert Simon on the right, who proposes that policymakers tend to adopt the positions of key trusted allies. In other words, acting as a bloc in this way has sort of de-risked the action. As new states continue to join RGGI, it's an especially promising case for the scale up of regional carbon markets. Next slide, please. Finally, California has cultivated its reputation as an environmental leader, and under its cap and trade system, emissions from regulated entities have declined by over 16% between 2013 and just before the pandemic. However, for the market mechanism to be sustainable, revenues must be dispersed in a transparent and socially admissible manner. And in California, failures in the planning phase of the revenue scheme have created a somewhat controversial and competing political factions, wide-ranging influence campaigns in order to secure public funding for various causes. And volatility of revenues has provoked contention and erosion among statewide environmental alliances. So this underscores the need for a very defined vision of the policy impacts to be agreed from the outset. Next slide, please. And so as we look to to recent developments with the Biden administration's climate agenda caught in contentious budget negotiations now, we can certainly learn from previous cases to develop an effective approach. Climate mitigation must continue to be framed in the national discourse as a salient priority with impending consequences for both individual and social welfare. There must be mutual trust among a coalition of stakeholders in order to achieve a joint commitment to a specific carbon pricing vision. Broad stakeholder engagement capable of incorporating local knowledge into the planning process is critical for facilitating this long-term durability. And carbon pricing legislation must continue to apply the revenues concretely in order to show tangible benefits to get around this unpalatable idea of taxation. Clearly, there remains ingrained opposition on these policies, but successful models inform this conclusion that carbon pricing is worthwhile and well within the realm of feasibility in the United States and in other countries where climate ambition has lagged. We cannot afford to abandon this important instrument at this critical time. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Timothy, for an excellent whirlwind tour of various carbon pricing and market mechanisms that we have across North America, with excellent insights on the lessons learned or that we should be learning along the way. Thank you very much. And from the United States to Canada, we are delighted now to host our final speaker of the session before we move into Q&A, which means if you do have questions, please submit them via the Q&A function. And while you do that, I will introduce Sarah Norton, who's going to speak to us about zero carbon tourism through law and policy frameworks for building global tourism back better. Sarah, you have the floor.
Thank you, and thank you so much to the University of Cambridge and its many partners and organizers for hosting this event. It's an honor to be here. If I could just have the presentation up, that would be fantastic. The COVID-19 pandemic has stifled the international tourism industry, a sector that activists and scholars have heavily criticized for its detrimental impact on climate change. The industry is estimated to account for roughly 5 to 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And by 2030, the United Nations World Tourism Organization anticipates that greenhouse gas emissions could increase in the sector by 25% if it continues business as usual. There is already a significant body of work published on tourism in a decarbonizing world, suggesting that tourism can benefit from the green economy and that the green economy will likewise benefit tourism. Claire Petula, Cassandra Hayward, and I seek to contribute to this research by exploring how tourism can better align with international climate change commitments post-pandemic. Next slide, please. Throughout 2020, the COVID-19 virus containment measures contributed to an 80% decrease in international travel, and it's not expected to financially recover to pre-pandemic levels until at least 2023. Building tourism back better in a way that better aligns with the low carbon transition and climate resilience is of dual benefit, taking advantage of this opportunity to meet the sector's commitment of reducing its greenhouse gas emissions by 70% by 2050. Next slide, please. Analyses underscores a growing gap between greenhouse gas mitigation initiatives and tourism-related emissions. Despite this, there's little evidence of significant mitigation action within the tourism sector. In fact, trends show that the gap between promised reductions and the actual emissions of the sector is continuing to grow despite existing international standards and codes. A few of these existing standards and codes include the United Nations World Tourism Organization, which promotes responsible, sustainable, and universally accessible tourism. Its key document is the Global Code of Ethics for Tourism, a non-legally binding code designed to guide stakeholders in tourism development. As of 2021, 49 of the member states of the UNWTO have incorporated the code into their legislative texts, and another 48 have used the same principles to establish national laws, regulations, and policies. Next is the World Travel and Tourism Council, the WTTC, representing private sector interests, researching economic and social potential and impacts, which has over 200 members. Teaming up with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, its key output is the Climate Friendly Travel Registry of 2050 Climate Neutral and Sustainability Ambitions, allowing travel and tourism companies and organizations to state their progression and contribution toward the goal of carbon neutrality by 2050. International Organization of Standardization, otherwise known as ISO, has established numerous standards pertaining to sustainable tourism, providing a comprehensive guide to stakeholders on the minimum requirements their operations need to achieve to be considered sustainable. And lastly is the Global Sustainable Tourism Council, GSTC. The GSTC is an independent nonprofit organization which establishes and manages global sustainable travel and tourism standards based on ISO standards and other globally recognized guidelines. The GSTC has a wide range of members, including national and provincial governments, industry and civil society stakeholders, and provides two sets of sustainable travel criteria, the first being industry-based, the second being government and destination-based. With minimum progress towards decarbonizing the tourism sector, there's a well-established need for greater clarity and scope of mechanisms for the enforcement, development, and monitoring of sustainable tourism. International guidelines on what sustainability should look like in the sector is highly fragmented between different states and these various organizations. More than ever, policies and laws around the tourism sector's sustainable development are needed to build the industry back better, deviating from the business as usual where emissions increase alongside sectoral growth. Next slide, please. Our research examined the case studies of Costa Rica, Fiji, and Finland, which serve as examples of countries that have prioritized low carbon, environmentally friendly tourism standards pre-pandemic. The case studies illuminated in this paper outline key policies and programs used to transition the tourism sector, offering examples and providing opportunities for other countries to adopt and scale. Next slide, please. Despite these country successes, alongside existing international standards and codes, in pushing sustainability through legislation and policy related to the tourism industry, more can be done to combat the negative externalities of travel on the climate through more aligned laws and ecotourism policies. Emissions abatement through increased energy efficiency and investment in renewables while offsetting emissions is more cost effective than offsetting alone. Countries should aim to develop and invest in long-term sustainability policies in the tourism sector. To help foster sustainable tourism support, governments should consult extensively with public and industry stakeholders, diversifying connections with subnational actors and understanding domestic context within the tourism industry could promote more localized sustainability and facilitate knowledge sharing transnationally. In addition to national tourism priorities, including economic impact and development, governments should determine their sector's impact on sustainability. In doing so, policies can be developed to transition the most harmful activities first. We also recommend a more extensive study or commission to be conducted through the UNFCCC. As a dominant voice in international climate action, the UNFCCC can influence governments and industry decisions on their economic and tourism models towards a more sustainable framework. Though Costa Rica, Fiji, and Finland's sustainable tourism legislation and policy serve as examples of how countries pursue sustainable tourism, there's more opportunities for sustainable tourism to explore. Those countries that advance sustainable tourism could end up recovering from the externalities of the COVID-19 pandemic faster and better than those that do not. Next slide, please. I want to thank you so much for your time and allowing us to share our research with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you to your co-authors and co-researchers, some of whom I've had the privilege of working with for several years. It is really insightful to hear this aspect, which we often don't hear discussed in our ideas and concepts of how we transition and how we look at economics in this context, so thank you. And I see that we have 3 questions in our question and answer box. If you do have anything else you would like to ask our panelists, please, audience members, do feel free. Participants are encouraged to ask questions, but I will start with a question that comes to us from Russia. And the question is, dear colleagues, in your opinion, how does the current international public law, specifically in terms of the fight against climate change, affect the regulation of universal access to sustainable energy sources? And specifically, it's clarified that, that Mr. Arzatsky is asking about what international legal mechanisms and instruments are of key importance in sustainable energy regulation, and how might we improve on them? So that is quite a question to unpack. It may indeed be the subject of a PhD in itself, but if anyone would like to take a crack at that, please do feel free. We also have questions in the chat from my intrepid co-chair, so some to specific panelists. I think more to Catherine, the idea of, we know that there are many climate laws around the world now in existence, but is there a way of assessing their efficacy, as in quantifying their impact on emissions? So that's actually a fascinating question I was talking about in another context this morning. And also, what proportion of climate framework laws have an accountability mechanism? Matthew also asks, specifically in the context of Poland, which has such a unique set of pressures and concerns, being on the edge of Europe and dependent on domestic coal or Russian gas, as well as the air quality concerns in a number of cities, how can Poland potentially balance decarbonization with energy independence, and allow itself to continue the transition in the context of also not being dependent on Russia? And Stacey Alvarez, who joins us today from Barbados, from the Worldwide Sustainability Warriors, asks a question to everyone. What are some of the practical legislative steps and legal mechanisms that can be created to include the voice of youth in shaping public policy regarding climate change? And that is certainly a theme that, if you will be joining us for the Climate Law and Governance Day event next week, will be addressed in a number of our panels as well. So perhaps the best way to do this is to go to each of our panelists and see what you would like to address first. Sarah, since you finished speaking last, would you like to go first? Or perhaps I should ask if you would like to go first, because, you know, questions always inspire various levels of enjoyment, but would you please go first?
I might pass. I've just been thinking on the last question, and I'd really like to contribute if I can, but maybe last, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Then we will go Timothy. If we still have Timothy, do you have any ideas, contributions? There you are.
I suppose on this question of engaging youth as well, I am honored to have participated on the youth climate delegation to COP24, and I think, you know, this sort of opportunities for structured observer participation, including through official, you know, coalitions, including the Youngos and the Ringos, has really driven a lot of formal channels for youth to engage through UNFCCC processes, and provides an excellent platform for youth to then take home into the domestic advocacy space lessons from the negotiations that can be applied through both formal legislative advocacy, as well as movements and social movements that have captured the public attention in recent years. And so I certainly hope that we can sustain this momentum at COP26. And certainly the youth perspective is a much needed one, as this is the future that they will inherit. I'm sure I'll leave this to other colleagues to further my thoughts on this.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Timothy. We really do appreciate it. And we are grateful that you had the opportunity to participate in COPs from a young age and thus become part of the community from an early point. And as you are growing in your own research, to join and share that as well, which is why it's so important to include the youth. Going in reverse order, then Ayman, is there anything you would like to add?
Well, I will try, because I heard the questions from Matthew. So
yes,
plurals, but it is very tough questions. And Poland belonging to the EU is, in many issues, guarantee of safety and growth. And on the other hand, we're border with Russia being the sources of our historical threats and still being our energy background. And on the other hand, we have activities of Polish government. So, you know, I don't know what will be the Polish policy in the field of independent from Russia sources, but I just want to say that the Polish government is, recognized as acting on many occasions against EU energy and climate intentions. And Poland, we can say, is a country which is clearly floundering in its energy policy. On the one hand, it makes decisions in opposition to other EU member states. To recall, for example, Polish Prime Minister blocking the EU climate strategy, the government position that the coal is to be the main source of energy to 2050, the legislative confusions connected to renewable sources of energy. And on the other hand, Polish authorities appears in the Just Transition declarations. I'm talking about the Silesia Declaration on Solidarity and Just Transition. And also Katowice, as the capital of COP24, has strongly connection with the Katowice rulebook, which is very important. And, the Polish vision of just energy transition and climate policy is full of paradoxes. So probably I will not answer right now for that, but this is very good and very tough questions. So thank you, but I'm not Polish government, I can only share with you my observations.
And it is sometimes the best answer not to have it like the ideal answer, but to talk about all the issues that are involved. And certainly this week in particular, with the court having, the European Court having its decision, really does highlight the kind of the paradoxes. So thank you, Magdalena. Ayman, I see a hand. We'll go to Ayman, then we'll go to Catherine.
Thank you very much. Very briefly address, although the question wasn't addressed to me directly, but Matthew's point about efficacy and efficiency of law and looking at it from a more general perspective. Briefly, where a different hat I have as Deputy Chair of the IUC and Work Commission on Environmental Law, to indicate that there is ongoing work in terms of measuring the efficacy and efficiency of law through legal indicators. And as such, to invite Matthew to pay specific attention to Resolution 050 that was adopted earlier this year at the World Conservation Congress. And the World Commission on Environmental Law will be organizing with partners in France in December an event that will be looking broadly at measuring the efficacy and efficiency of environmental law through legal indicators. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ayman. And if you do have any information about that event, if there's a link or anything, please do post it in the chat. If not, we'll all look forward to it later on. And Catherine, would you like to address the series of questions that were posed to you?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So maybe if I take up where Ayman left off on this kind of point about efficacy. So there has actually been some work done looking at the quantitative emissions reduction that we could potentially attribute to climate change laws by former GRI colleague Sam Fankhauser, who's now at Oxford, and Sheikh Iskander. And they found that on average, each new law reduces annual carbon dioxide emissions per unit of gross domestic product by 0.78% nationally in the short term. So that was during the first 3 years since its passage. But then after that, that increases to about 1.79%. And they estimated the cumulative emission savings that could be attributable to climate laws between 1999 and 2016 as being 38 gigatons of carbon dioxide, so roughly equivalent to 1 year of global output. So that's obviously just one way of kind of quantifying effectiveness. There's also been some more qualitative research done by GRI colleagues on the effectiveness of the UK Climate Change Act in particular, and that was done through various interviews with those involved in working with the Act. And there was a consensus that the Act has had a big impact on sort of changing the debate in the UK and making sure that it's more focused on the implementation of policy rather than the overall objectives. So a few points there. To address the issue of the proportion of climate change framework laws that have accountability mechanisms, mechanisms from our paper. And unfortunately, this is the heat map I didn't quite have time to show you. So we found that almost every law contains some form of MRV or a similar kind of monitoring and evaluation and learning framework. But that is really where the bulk of the accountability mechanisms sit at the moment. There are many fewer laws that contain provisions on parliamentary oversight. Where those exist, they tend to be a bit more high level. They don't contain a lot of detail, which we're concerned could lead to a kind of lack of resourcing for that oversight. And only about 5 laws have specific provisions on judicial review and judicial oversight, although of course many of the other pieces of legislation could lead to judicial oversight without that being explicitly included. And then finally, if I can, I'd just like to comment on this sort of final point on practical legislative steps and legal mechanisms that can be created to include the voice of youth. So this is one of the things that we actually started talking about and we touch on in the paper, but don't go into detail. So there have been some interesting moves recently to try and introduce deliberative democratic processes into initial decision-making on what kind of policy action should be taken to achieve a country's net zero targets. And we see interesting examples from Ireland, from France, one from the UK convened by the UK Parliament. There could be a much stronger youth focus in those. And we are also interested, we think there's real potential in thinking about whether those processes could also be used to inform sort of review and oversight processes. So for example, could you incorporate a youth or citizen oversight committee in a parliamentary reporting or oversight process where you give a kind of voice to other groups that then interacts with that sort of voice from the legislature. Obviously, there's questions then about kind of, well, which has authority in terms of, you know, this is the democratically elected legislature, this is maybe a sort of randomly selected citizen or youth jury, but I think it's a really interesting idea and one that could certainly be explored further.
Fantastic, Catherine. Thank you so very much. I think in the interest of time, we will now wrap up unless any of our panelists have any final words they would like to add. And so we will wrap up quickly, and I will wrap up on behalf of Matthew to say, first of all, a huge congratulations and thank you to all of you for these really brilliant insights. And what is truly fascinating is that across all of the presentations, across all of the discussions, we see the importance of not only including flexibility in transition concepts, but also flexibility in the mechanisms that we generate and we implement to enforce them. And particularly when we think about the post-pandemic construct of law, construct of society, and how we not only build forward or build back, depending on the rhetoric better, but also how we anticipate what society will expect from law in the future in terms of responsiveness and in terms of rapidity of response and ability to be flexible. These types of discussions are critical, and they will continue to be quite critical and quite important into the future. So we hope that this has been a bit of an insight into many of these issues. We encourage everyone to be in touch if you are coming to COP26. Certainly there are a number of both climate law and governance events, as well as also partner events that you would be more than welcome to attend either in person or virtually. But please do stay in touch with us. And we do also hope that you will join us in several moments when we go into our next panel, which will be a panel in plenary on climate in practice, climate change law in practice. It is hosted with the Net Zero Lawyers Alliance and should be a truly fascinating set of insights for everyone. But again, thank you all. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for your feedback as well. And I would like to say a huge thank you and express all of our collective gratitude to the organizers, to the volunteers and the students who brought this to us all and brought this together and made sure that everything functioned so well and the PowerPoints worked, etc. So thank you. Your contributions certainly are noted. Have a lovely day. Be well. Take care wherever you are. Thank you.